On behalf of the Department of History here at the University of Richmond, I would like to welcome you to our campus. We've been making this welcome now this is the 22nd annual lecture. There's not a lot of things in America that have stayed the same in the last 22 years. I've been thinking about that. I'm 50% older. My son aged from 4 to 26. The Dow, when the first lecture was given, was not quite at 5,000. At that time, President Trump was a liberal Democrat in his middle of his second marriage to Marla Maples. Barack Obama was about to be elected to the Illinois State Senate. But one area of continuity has been our relationship, the department, the university, with both the Museum of the Confederacy initially and now with the American Civil War Museum, and it's been a wonderful relationship. I'm curious, is there anyone who's come to every single one of these lectures? John has, I'm sure, yeah. I don't think I could say. While I was there at the first one, and I've been here, I think all but maybe one or two, but I was just curious. So, well, again, I want to thank you for coming, and I'd now like to introduce Christy Coleman of the museum, who will introduce our speaker.
Good evening, everyone. How are you? Good. Thank you so much for coming out, and thank you, Bob. The relationship with the University of Richmond History Department, this co-sponsorship, has been a really amazing thing. There are very few relationships anymore that last 22 years. And it might be because we only see each other once a year. I don't know. But anyway, we want to thank you all so much for joining us for the 22nd Annual Elizabeth Roller Bottimore Lecture. As you can see from the back of your program, the Bottimore Lecture, as he said, kicked off 21 years ago in April of 1996 with a series of 4 lectures, one of them by none other than Bob. Was the first one. And he's, again, been an integral part of the Bottimore Lecture series from the beginning, and we're grateful to him for all the success and the work that he's done to make these lectures successful. Also in your program, you will find a brief biography about Elizabeth Roller Bottimore, after whom these lectures are named. We in the Richmond cultural community are indebted to the Roller Bottimore Foundation for support of this and many other programs at the museum. Over the past 22 years, the Bottimore Lectures have, in fact, specialized in bringing our audiences new perspectives on Civil War history from both well-known historians and up-and-coming superstars in the profession, often speaking on their works in progress. This year, we knew we wanted to invite one of those up-and-coming superstars, Dr. Yael Sternhell. Now, I have to say that for those of us English speakers, she's always so very patient with us. Most people call her Yael. That's not right. It's Yael. All right, you got it? Say it with me. Yael. Thank you. Okay, so, excuse me. So she's our Bottimore Lecturer this year, and she's Associate Professor of History and American Studies at Tel Aviv University in Israel. Her work brings her often to the United States, so we were reasonably confident that we could get her, given her busy schedule. But this has been an especially busy year for her. She and her husband, Dr. Ishai Rosenzvi, who is a professor of Jewish studies at Tel Aviv University as well, welcomed their first child, beautiful daughter Ariel, who is in the back of the room. And we are very pleased that they consented to include us on their 2017 American tour. So here's the thing. What topic could we possibly ask her to speak about? Because the topic of her book has already been published, and there's also this question about, again, work in progress. And needless to say, there's a mercenary temptation to go with the book already published so that, we can sell a few. But after discussing it with her and among ourselves, we resisted this temptation and opted to to showcase the work in progress. But first, let me tell you about Dr. Sternhell's previous work. After graduating summa cum laude from Hebrew University in Israel, Yael went to Princeton University, where she earned her MA and PhD studying with Dr. James M. McPherson. Her doctoral dissertation became her first books, Routes of War, The World of Movement in the Confederate South, published in 2012 by Harvard University Press. The book was a finalist for the Lincoln Prize, a choice outstanding academic title, and the co-winner of the Southern Historical Association's prize for the best first book. Reviewing Routes of War for Choice, Emory Thomas wrote, quote, Sternhell has written a pioneering study of the creation and downfall of the Confederacy. This original, imaginative, and persuasive book, a must-have for any U.S. collection, will transform understanding of the Civil War. The author posits that incessant motion between battlefields, plantations, and other traditional sites of Civil War history shaped the Confederate South and shook the region to its foundations, ultimately transforming it forever, end quote. Incidentally, we do have copies of this book for sale tonight, and I'm sure she will be willing to sign it for you. As I believe Dr. Sternhell will explain in her program tonight, she discovered her new research topic while working on her previous one, War on Record, the Archive and the Making of the Civil War History, 1861 to 1901. And this is under contract, by the way, with Yale University. Now, what convinced us to have her talk about her work in progress was the fascinating article she published in the Journal of American History. And last year, this article was published last year, and it was entitled The Afterlives of a Confederate Archive, Civil War Documents and the Making of Sectional Reconciliation. Most of us in the trade are familiar with the OR, and if you're thinking about medical operating room, nope, that's not it. OR for us is shorthand for the original records, which are the bread and butter of Civil War research. Who knew the rich and fascinating backstory behind their compilation and publication? After tonight, you will. So, without further ado, I am pleased to introduce to you all Dr. Yael Sternhell. Thank you. I guess I shouldn't take it.
All right, hello, good evening. Thank you for that exceedingly generous introduction, and thank you, of course, to John Koski, the American Civil War Museum, the University of Richmond, Professor Ed Ayers, and Professors Nicole Sackley and Eric Yellen for your very generous hospitality here. I'm delighted to be back in Richmond, a city that I've always had a special connection with, and probably the most appropriate place to speak about the Civil War as an object of knowledge. Recently, the war has been on many people's minds as events in Charlottesville have put a spotlight on the very fraught question of how communities commemorate the conflict. Some participants in the national conversation have pointed out the crucial distinction between history and memory. The American Historical Association, for example, has described history as comprising both facts and interpretations of those facts, and has argued that a monument is not history itself. A monument commemorates an aspect of history, representing a moment in the past when a public or private decision defined who would be honored in a community's public spaces. Thus, memory is shifting, fluid, and contested, while history is fixed and certain. Regardless of whether you agree with this characterization of memory, I would actually like to focus on the part of history itself. How have we learned the facts that underlie our interpretations? What are the sources that conveyed them to us? And are these sources as pristine and foolproof as we imagine them to be? I'm approaching this question through the study of one source for Civil War history, yet it is not just any source. This is the source for professional historians and lay readers alike. The War of the Rebellion, a compilation of official records of the Union and Confederate armies, is a 128-volume set published between 1880 and 1901 by the federal government, which historians have, as Christy said, affectionately nicknamed the OR. As the title suggests, the compilation is comprised of official documents penned during the war on both sides. The volumes, consisting roughly 1,000 pages each, are organized in 4 series. The first, the most substantial and widely used, covers military operations. The second covers prisoners of war on both sides. The third assembles miscellaneous documents from the Union government, which did not find a place in Series 1. And the fourth series does the same for the Confederacy. It is hard to exaggerate the dominance of this source in the vast field of Civil War history. Already in 1939, Douglas Southwell Fremont, the dean of Confederate historians for much of the 20th century, said the following: "If it be true that the war between the states is now, with a few regrettable omissions, the most thoroughly and studied military conflict of modern times, the reason is the availability of the official records. This has remained the case until today. The official records form the basis of most, if not all, military histories, and in recent years, as the field has grown and diversified, it has proven a fruitful source for social, political, and cultural historians as well. It would not be an exaggeration to say that it has been used by practically every historian studying America's greatest conflict since the late 19th century." Why has the OR attained this kind of popularity? First, it effortlessly combines the immersive experience of archival research with the convenience of working in one's own home and local library. Perhaps more importantly, though, it comes across as a fully comprehensive, thoroughly neutral, and therefore entirely reliable source. The volumes of the first series consist solely of military records, eschewing any explicit engagement with politics or ideology. The tomes are organized spatially and temporally, moving between one campaign and the next, from one theater of operations to the other. Union and Confederate records appear side by side without additional commentary or context, allowing historical actors on both sides to speak for themselves. The OR, in short, comes across as the ultimate repository for hard facts on the Civil War. Yet hard facts do not just jump into books, and a series of 128 volumes does not just compile itself. The OR was the product of a decades-long editorial process that cost the government nearly $3 million, between $80 and $90 million in today's terms, and involved numerous politicians, bureaucrats, officers, veterans, and civilians who happened to have custody of wartime paperwork. The work of locating, organizing, selecting, arranging, comparing, proofreading, and printing this vast collection of documents was shaped by the personalities of those undertaking the work, but even more crucially, by the cultural mores and political agendas prevalent at the time. The collection we historians still use today is a quintessential creature of the late 19th century. What I would like to do here today is lay out what that actually means and how that has influenced the way we know or think we know the Civil War. So the OR did not actually originate as a historical project. The first attempt to collect and organize wartime papers began while the war was still going on and before its outcome was entirely clear. On April 21st, 1864, Senator Henry Wilson of Massachusetts introduced a joint resolution requiring the Secretary of War to print all reports, dispatches, and telegrams relating to the movements, engagements, and operations generally of the armies of the United States. Wilson was acting on a request by General Henry Halleck, the Army's chief of staff and master bureaucrat, who was struggling to keep up with the vast piles of paperwork generated by the Union's massive war machine. While we often think of the technological breakthroughs that made the Civil War a modern war, most notably the telegraph, the train, the ironclad ship, we rarely think of the war as a bureaucratic enterprise on a modern scale. Yet it certainly was. The management of two armies totaling 3 million men depended on efficient record-keeping run by battalions of clerks, and created an unprecedented amount of paperwork. The congressional decision, however, did little to alleviate the pressure. The Army's Assistant Adjutant General merely compiled 8 volumes of official reports, which never went into print. With the end of the war, the project ceased to be a pressing matter for the military, but in May 1866, Congress took up the issue again. By then, the context and meaning of publishing a documentary record of the Civil War had entirely changed. While easily accessible records of battles and campaigns were still useful, other considerations were now in play. In the time that had passed, the Civil War has transmuted from present into history. The Union Army's operations were no longer an urgent challenge requiring careful management through written records, but a glorious history in need of a reliable and permanent account. Furthermore, in 1866, the government was also in possession of Confederate records, stored in a special unit of the War Department called the Rebel Archives Bureau. Despite the still present hostility towards the South, Congress prioritized the collection's utility as a historical source and mandated that it would incorporate papers from both sides. Senator William Fessenden, a Republican representing Maine, stipulated that the Confederate and Union records on the same subject would be printed in juxtaposition so that the whole subject matter might be seen. Regardless of the enthusiasm senators showed for the project in that debate, Congress did not actually move ahead to appropriate funds. Only 8 years later, in June 1874, did the House of Representatives allocate a modest sum of $15,000 for the Secretary of War to copy for the public printer all reports, letters, telegrams, and general orders not heretofore copied or printed and properly arranged in chronological order. The decision to appropriate money seems to have resulted from a combination of circumstances: pressure from veteran groups, the interests of influential politicians who had also served as officers in the Union Army, like Secretary of War William Belknap and future President James Garfield, and also a palpable sense that the passage of time was endangering the invaluable records slowly decaying in government buildings. In the House debate that led to the appropriation, Representative John Coburn of Indiana warned that the records were in real danger of being lost, stolen, or destroyed, and thus a most important part of the history of the country may at any time, for want of proper protection of these records, be utterly annihilated. Having neglected this problem for nearly a decade, the government was now faced with the exigency of having to deal with a mammoth written record, document the mammoth victory it had achieved. Yet something else was also going on. 1874 was a landmark year in the history of national reconciliation. In November, the Democratic Party would sweep into power on Capitol Hill for the first time since 1860. Signs of the changing mood in the country were evident in the arguments senators made in support of the publication project. Everybody in the land, continued Coburn, whether he may have been engaged on one side or the other in the late rebellion, every lover of his country, everyone who delights in the preservation of its history, is interested in this matter. In 1874, the material exigencies of archival preservation finally met the political will required to address them, and the project went ahead. Significantly, the War Department never hired writers, academics, or archivists for the work of compiling the OR. The people in charge of the project over the course of 30 years were government clerks of varying backgrounds and training. The first problem they faced was the sheer volume of papers created and accumulated during the war. Years later, these papers were described as being well nigh beyond computation, being counted not by documents or boxes, but by tons, roomfuls, or the contents of buildings. The Confederate records alone crowded an entire 3-story building. Military telegrams were almost countless, a single collection of Union dispatches alone containing over 2 million. All these, as well as the files of the Secretary's office and the various bureaus of the War Department, had to be carefully read and considered, paper by paper, and if deemed proper for publication, copied and compared. Indeed, yet this seemingly technical description belies both the complexity and the grave meanings of the work involved in creating a publishable collection out of the vast Civil War archive. What did considering a Civil War record mean? What did proper for publication mean? Was it possible to include every report, letter, telegram, and general order penned during the war? Obviously not. So who actually decided which piece of paper would be included in a public collection and which would remain hidden within the confines of an archive? The War Department started with a clear directive stipulated in the Congressional Act that only official records created during the war would be included. This should have been an easy rule to follow, yet historically minded veterans, anxious about their own reputations and the reputation of their soldiers, had a hard time accepting that they would not be allowed to make up for the deficiencies in wartime record-keeping and would have to watch their heroic deeds condemned to oblivion on account of a missing report. Former officers approached the department time and again and pleaded to expand the notion of official to include post-war matter as well. In March 1877, for example, Union General Julius White, here pictured with his staff, responded to a request for a report on the participation of his unit in the Gettysburg campaign. Unable to locate the document, he proposed to provide a sworn statement on the course of events instead. This was, he claimed, a matter of historical justice towards the men who had sacrificed so much. There is frequent and just complaint made by subordinate officers and enlisted men of the neglect of their superiors to forward the reports of subordinates. It is due to the rank and file, if to no others, that all obtainable facts, duly verified, be fairly considered in recording the history of the war, even though not in strict official form. Suspecting that the War Department would not be amenable, he appealed for the insertion of unofficial records as a practical matter. The sloppiness of senior officers meant that the history of the war would never be complete if official information only, often mere abstracts of reports, is relied upon. Other veterans worried not about what was missing from the archive, but about what could be found in it. In November 1876, General George H. Gordon sent a narrative he had written on the operations of his brigade in the Virginia campaigns of 1862. Gordon had served in the Shenandoah Valley, where the Army had suffered a particularly humiliating defeat in the hands of Confederate General Stonewall Jackson. Gordon had heard a rumor that the War Department received reports compiled after the war, including one which was incorporated into an original document and reflected badly on his brigade. If the government was accepting new matter, he argued, none could be more reliable and truthful than the narrative he had sent, compiled from official reports and memoranda taken in the field. In response, Secretary of War J. Donald Cameron denied that any post-war report had been filed by someone else and reiterated the department's ground rule, publishing only strictly official matter. Nevertheless, participants in the war continued trying to sneak in post-war material and to ask the department to revise records they did not feel comfortable with. In 1882, Lieutenant Colonel Robert N. Scott, the chief compiler, testified to the various ways former officers were attempting to manipulate the work of compilation. Scott was a career officer in the Army with extensive knowledge of military law. His experience with wartime paperwork and with the use of documents as legal evidence sensitized him to officers' attempts to distort the records and to the absurdity of their claims that post-war recollections could be relied on. I have had a Union colonel apply for permission to retract a statement never made in his report of Ball's Bluff, he wrote. A general officer has complained that his report of Shiloh was garbled, but when shown his original report, he acknowledged that it was correctly printed. An attempt to ascertain who commanded a certain Confederate brigade in the Gettysburg campaign has developed two claimants for the position. Staving off attempts to insert post-war non-official material became one of Scott's most difficult duties in the decade he spent compiling the collection. Among the men whose personal correspondence was about to be published, there was also considerable discontent about the department's definition of official versus unofficial. Thomas Jordan, a former Confederate general and Civil War historian, had gained somehow access to proof sheets of a volume covering events in 1862 and found letters he had written to General Pierre T. Beauregard when the latter was not on duty. These letters, he insisted, are the offspring wholly of the close personal relations which existed between the general and myself. Responding to a similar request by the Secretary of the Navy, William E. Chandler, who had asked to leave out documents since they included much that is personal, Scott noted, "A great deal of the official correspondence coming under my observation contains much that is personal, and I submit that is not sufficient reason for omitting it." And yet Scott, truth be told, was prone to breaking his own rules when dealing with senior officers on the Union side. William T. Sherman, for example, was allowed to decide which of his many papers would be considered official and go into print, and George McClellan chose which papers to send from the collection he took home from the war. Authenticity was another fraught issue. The War Department aspired to publish only records it was absolutely certain had not been tampered with, and prided itself on its commitment to this principle. Yet this was obviously easier said than done. The department allowed officers sending in their papers to submit what they called certified copies instead of originals, leaving much room for post-war adaptations. Occasionally, Scott gave free expression to his suspicion of officers who submitted certified copies. In one case, he remarked to a Confederate captain who had clearly sent a modified report, "It is important that I should know whether or not the alterations made by your notes have simply corrected errors in the printed copy or have added new matter." At other times, officers were asked to verify the contents of documents that had appeared elsewhere, effectively giving them the option to amend the text by arguing that it was not correctly printed the first time. And thus, the same Thomas Jordan actually did receive permission to proofread and correct the printed copies of the letter he had sent his friend, successfully arguing that they were transcribed from what he called his rather ineligible handwriting. And these are actually the proof sheets with Jordan's handwriting as he's correcting the manuscript. The compilers were also faced with a disconcerting reality that even when papers were undoubtedly authentic, they did not necessarily convey a historical truth. The bitter disagreements between officers in both armies about essential details and the conflicting accounts they provided of the same events forced the War Department to grapple with the inherent malleability of historical knowledge. Two people taking part in the same battle did not necessarily witness the same things, nor did they interpret what they saw in the same way. What more, even strictly official reports were often actually composed weeks or months after the events they were describing. Finally, Scott knew enough about Army life to realize that senior officers reporting on a battle in which they played a prominent role could not be relied on to tell the truth and nothing but the truth. Attempting to parse the disputes between Union officers after the Battle of Gettysburg, Scott wrote to the son of one general, "It is a matter of not small difficulty to decide upon what ought or ought not appear in the publication of the war records, even when in matters of controversy we have all or both or more sides of the question." Equally crucial was the question of which documents were important enough to be included in a historical collection aspiring to be the definitive history of the war. During nearly 30 years of compiling, War Department officials made numerous decisions on the historical value of documents, yet unfortunately, they reflected on their decision-making process only rarely. While the original language of the 1874 Act called for copying and printing all reports, letters, telegrams, and general orders, the War Department knew well that this would be impossible. The published collection, in fact, ended up encompassing only a fraction of the paper stored in Washington. Among the types of papers excluded were applications of all kinds, charges of disloyalty, claims of all description, and most crucially, ordinary routine business of the Bureau and departments. Again, what was routine? What was ordinary? This was never explained, not just to posterity, but to the very people providing the records. So, for instance, when Scott wrote the Paymaster General to ask for records, he merely specified he needed all reports, letters, etc. of record in your department and illustrating its operations, other of mere routine during the war, and deemed by you of sufficient importance and historical value for publication. Hence today, we are still writing and reading histories based on what military men in the 1870s and 1880s thought was sufficiently important and historically valuable. And while the National Archives opened in 1934 and have since allowed public access to the records that did not make it into the OR, the predominance of the printed and bound volumes means that any document included in the compilation still receives the kind of exposure no source housed in a brick-or-mortar archive ever will. An even greater issue is the fact that most Americans are effectively excluded from the OR. Women are entirely absent. African Americans appear mostly as nameless, voiceless slaves or are mentioned as low-level soldiers. Even poor white men are hard to come by, as they were only rarely found among the senior officers whose reports and correspondence fill the volumes of the compilation. The OR privileges a particular perspective on the Civil War: white, male, military, and more likely than not, elite. It is the story of the war through the eyes of the officers running it, who were in some ways, of course, the most informed participants, but for the same reason were also the most biased and those who had the most to lose. While historians in recent decades have done a great deal to compensate for these gaps and have dug deep into alternative repositories for testimonies of Americans who were previously shut out of the historical record, the omnipresence of the OR in libraries around the country, and nowadays also online, still grants it a special state as the baseline of Civil War history, the starting point to which all other sources must relate. If abundance was the first problem compilers of the OR had to contend with, scarcity was the second. Wartime record-keeping was extensive, but lacked a unified system, and the collection stored in the War Department was full of gaping holes. This was, unsurprisingly, particularly true for Confederate records. The Union Army began collecting enemy papers as soon as it entered Richmond, in the hopes of finding incriminating evidence that could serve as a basis for putting the leadership of the rebellion on trial. Halleck appointed his aide-de-camp, Colonel Richard D. Cutts, as keeper of the public archives, and ordered rooms in the Customs House, still standing, cleared for storage of captured papers. Cutts soon began sending to Washington box after box of correspondence, orders, accounts, statutes, reports, and all other manner of official records. Despite the wealth of paperwork in his charge, Cutts warned his superiors that he was sending mostly debris, as the truly valuable material had been carried off before the evacuation of Richmond, and most of what was left behind had been destroyed during the fire or plundered by relic hunters. Yet some of the more desirable papers turned up after all. The archives of the Confederate War Department, amounting to 80 boxes, were discovered in Charlotte, North Carolina, and some of Jefferson Davis's papers were found along his route of escape from Richmond to Georgia, where he was captured. By late June, the federal government had custody of several hundred boxes, barrels, mail bags of Confederate papers sent from all over the South. And yet, as we know, no trials ever took place, and the records were eventually stored in the Rebel Archives Bureau. Some were used to defend the government against claims filed by Southerners for compensation for property lost during the war. Others simply gathered dust until work on the OR got underway. When War Department clerks began examining the Confederate archive, they realized they were missing many of the most historically valuable papers. If the OR was to present both sides of the conflict as Congress had mandated, the space allocated to each had to be, if not identical, at least similar. The department was aware of the fact that the solution rested with the stockpiles of Confederate documents scattered around the South in the homes of individuals and in the archives of private societies. Nominally, these records were the property of the federal government, yet that did not mean very much in practice. As Secretary of War Belknap acknowledged, the only way to obtain these records was by purchase. As no appropriation for the mass purchase of records had been made, the only remaining option was negotiating with ex-Confederates to give or loan their private papers to the government they had fought for 4 long years. This mission was further complicated by the fact that relations between former rebels and the War Department were notoriously toxic. For years, ex-Confederates had tried to gain access to the documents kept in the Rebel Archives Bureau, most of the time to no avail. Outside parties were generally barred from the office, and orders for research to be conducted by clerical staff were usually answered in the negative. Beyond a habit of secrecy and lingering animosity towards the South, the Rebel Archives had become a crucial resource for the federal government, its only shield against tens of thousands of claims. The result was that most applications for papers from the archives were flatly refused. So the state of Virginia, for example, asked in 1869 for its executive journals from the war era, but was denied. When its former governor, John Letcher, applied individually for his private papers in 1877, even a recommendation by the Secretary of the Navy was of no help. The unavailability of the Confederate records was a source of immense frustration for Southerners devoted to studying and commemorating the history of the Civil War. This was by no means the majority of ex-Confederates. In the years immediately following the war, Southerners were generally preoccupied with rebuilding their lives in a radically altered social, political, and economic environment. While memorial activities for Confederate dead began during the war and continued in its aftermath, most men and women involved in the Confederate war effort were eager to set aside the trauma of defeat and move on. Nevertheless, amidst what sometimes seemed like willful forgetfulness, a few stepped forward as professional gatekeepers of the Confederate past. In 1869, a group of former officers founded the Southern Historical Society, an organization dedicated to the preservation and propagation of the Confederate version of the war. The society began collecting documents for what was essentially a competing enterprise to the Rebel Archives Bureau, and in 1877 launched its own publication project, the Southern Historical Society Papers. While often struggling financially and with little popular following, the Southern Historical Society aspired to gain ownership of the Confederate historical records. Its zealous executives were humiliated by the fact that a great store of papers were hidden away in Washington and deeply suspicious of the use the government was making of its holdings. Thus, when approached by the War Department with repeated requests to contribute papers, including a conciliatory offer to receive first copies of the printed volumes, society officials declined. The SHS would cooperate on one condition and one condition only: complete reciprocity. If the government wanted papers, it would have to open its own archive too. War Department bureaucrats fumed at the intransigence of the Southern Historical Society. In an angry letter from February 1877, they admonished the Society's secretary, J. William Jones. The War Department, wrote one compiler, had no obligation to publish anything but the papers in its own archive. Yet he was eager that The motives and actions of neither side should remain in doubt or be misconstrued because of the absence in an official governmental history, published to the world as an authentic record of records that are still in existence and are accessible. If your society does not practically unite in this desire, it would be a source of personal regret, but not a matter of concern to the department, whose rules have been stretched to the utmost. Despite these fighting words, the federal government would soon succumb to the society's demands. Less than a year after this exchange, Secretary of War George McCrary appointed Robert N. Scott as chief compiler. Scott had served the Union honorably during the war, but he was born and raised in the South and was arrested in 1861 for voicing pro-Southern opinions in public. Whether still motivated by conflicting loyalties or simply by a clear vision of how the collection would best serve its users, Scott made the crucial decision to arrange Union and Confederate documents side by side. By all means, he wrote the Secretary of War in his first report, the Union and Confederate accounts of any event should be given in the same volume. This, to my mind, is a matter of vital importance to the national welfare. Scott went on to appoint a former Confederate general, Marcus J. Wright, as agent for the collection of Confederate papers. Wright had been active in this area for years and had already sold the federal government one collection for $2,000. Quite a hefty sum in the 1870s. As soon as he was appointed, he contacted a range of senior ex-Confederates and their heirs and published a circular letter in Southern newspapers urging officers to send their papers to him. In his first month alone, he secured promises of documents from Jefferson Davis, Stephen D. Lee, and from the widow of Nathan B. Forrest. Wright also contacted the Southern Historical Society, whose executives did not lose time in making their old demand for unrestricted copying privileges from the rebel archives in exchange for the Society's documents. This time, they had an enthusiastic backer in Wright, who brought the issue up in his first report to Scott. Scott was reluctant at first, claiming that the War Department had actually allowed senior Confederates in the past to get from the Union archives such data as has enabled them to wage a supplemental war. He was averse to making any bargain with individuals or groups on either side of the sectional divide. Yet Wright was able to persuade the Secretary of War to make this concession, and the Southern Historical Society was officially afforded copying privileges by the War Department. Jones, the Society's secretary, reveled in his victory, telling a newspaper that the War Department's offer, made voluntarily and without condition, was all that we had ever asked and was in the highest degree gratifying to our committee. Jones was therefore promptly invited to Washington and was allowed for the first time to set foot in the Rebel Archives Bureau. From that moment on, the SHS became a crucial partner in the compilation process, providing not just missing records, but also fact-checking and correction services to the volumes before they went into print. Federal copyists were regularly stationed in Richmond, and the War Department published for the Society its catalog of Confederate papers. The government also established a productive collaboration with no other than Confederate General Jubal Early. Early was the quintessential Lost Cause warrior, serving as president of the Southern Historical Society and generally devoting his post-war life to promulgating the Southern version of the war. In August 1879, he was approached by Edwin J. Harris, the first ex-Confederate to serve as a clerk in the war, in the office managing the OR. Harris was hired for the specific task of proofing and verifying thousands of names, dates, and other details in Confederate paperwork. Once he had established a relationship with Early, the War Department regularly used the aging general in examining and proofreading records and for hunting down absent documents. In exchange, Scott offered Early easy access to the Rebel Archives Bureau, often voluntarily. Did you ever see the correspondence in relation to yourself between Governor Smith and General Lee transmitted by the Return to the War Department October 14, 1864? He asked at the end of a routine letter searching for missing documents. If you so desire, I will send you copies. A close working relationship also formed between Scott and Jefferson Davis, who was living in a Mississippi plantation and working on his history of the Confederacy. Davis had a hard time trusting the War Department and doubted whether Wright could actually ensure the interests of ex-Confederates and their records as an employee of the federal government. Nevertheless, time and again, the former Confederate president furnished papers from his private collection to dispatches and filled in missing words or numbers. Is it asking too much to request that you furnish me with a list of such of your dispatches, letters, or telegrams to General Lee as you are willing to furnish for the compilation? Read a typical letter from Scott to Davis in 1879. Scott paid Davis by sending him back his private letters that had been in the government's hands since 1865, by providing him with free copies of the published volumes, and most crucially, by agreeing to withhold documents Davis did not want published. Davis's services were deemed so helpful, he was thanked effusively by Secretary of War Elihu Root in the introduction to the last volume of the compilation. It would not be far-fetched to argue that for both Davis and Early, working with the War Department on the OR began as a utilitarian decision meant to ensure they maintained some control over their portrayal by a former enemy. But over time, the collaboration grew into a deeper relationship, which gave these former rebels a sense of partnership, if not ownership, of the official history. A spirit of national reconciliation thus did not just inspire the organization of the OR. The decades-long compilation process had the unintended consequence of incorporating those who had attempted to break away from the federal government into the very same government's effort to create a historical record of their failed attempt. And so what do we make of all of this? First, there is no such thing as an entirely authoritative historical source. The OR was a product of particular ideas about history prevalent at the moment of its compilation. And the editorial process, though undertaken by competent persons and vested with the authority of the federal government, was rife with errors and omissions that have determined our perception of events. Second, a collection of records conceived as a tool for the Union Army in its war against the Confederacy and named War of the Rebellion. Rebellion, considered, of course, a slur word, as John Koski has reminded us, when used by Northerners towards Southerners in the 19th century. This collection ended up as a joint effort of Union and Confederate veterans. While the OR will likely continue to serve as our go-to source, in this season of reckoning with the legacy of the war, we might want to think about the history we know not as a series of raw, unblemished facts, but as a body of knowledge that has come down to us after having been processed by a host of different people and altered by a range of different circumstances. Documents, unlike monuments, were created by historical actors while events were taking place. But like monuments, they too have lived complex lives of their own. Thank you very much. So, questions, concerns? Yes, please.
Are you are familiar with the supplement, the official records?
Yeah.
Published by Tom Broadfoot. It consists, for anybody who doesn't know, it's roughly about 100 volumes. And he had a team of historians in over a 5 to 7 year period scoured the country from one end to the other. Private collections, universities, and so on. And a lot of the records that were considered to be not found in the official records found their way into the supplement. And so it kind of backfills.
Right. And the supplement actually looks and feels like the official records, which only shows us to the extent that the paradigm of the official records has become the paradigm for collecting records of Civil War history.
To use current terminology, is it accurate for me to think that some of the OR is fake news?
Is it fake news? Look, no one can vouch for every piece of paper in the OR. Generally speaking, the records are close to the truth in terms of truth being what people wrote down at a certain moment about a certain event. We'll never know whether the certified copies were actual copies or modifications. We work with this source, I think all of us Civil War historians, not just because it's so seductive, but also because we don't have better options. But we should be more skeptical of it. Maybe not think of it as fake news. Maybe that's taking it a tad too far. But definitely questioning it as a late 19th century version of the Civil War rather than the Civil War period.
What do you think is the most important thing that was not included in your opinion?
I mean, definitely what was considered routine, which I think today for us cultural social historians is often the most interesting, and that's been left out. I think we would know so much more about how the Army actually operated, how people thought and operated, and on the individual level rather than on the level of a brigade, a battalion, even a regiment. And then second are the missing voices, the fact that our default source for Civil War history consists only, like I said, of elite white men, makes it a very problematic source to work with. And even that we now know better and have other ways of completing the historical picture that all of us try to paint, still I think we're in many ways in the hands of the OR, and thus the voices in the OR always come first, and then everything else comes second. Yes, in the back, please.
Thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you.
So I thought it was interesting how the arrangement of the OR sits Confederate accounts alongside Union accounts. And I'm just wondering, in your personal opinion, do you think if, in a current event context, if we had, say, a Confederate monument side by side with the Union monument, for instance, like Lee and Grant side by side, do you think we would be having some of the same tension that we're having today?
That's an interesting question, and actually a very smart way to pose these two areas of Civil War memory, the print and the stone, if you wish. I think that's what's interesting, is that in the OR, it's Union and Confederate side by side, but often in Southern monuments, it's just Confederate. And so the OR version of the Civil War is indeed very reconciliationist. It attempts to put both of these stories together and give a picture of the conflict scene from both sides. But that's not what we get when we, walk down certain avenues, corridors across the South. Would it be useful? I think there are a lot of smart people on the commission that's examining things here in Richmond, a lot of smart people thinking about it across the country. Would that be a solution? Maybe. But I think that, the difference between a federal initiative, which is the OR, that juxtaposes the stories, and then local initiatives that only highlight the Confederate version of the Civil War. These are two pretty different things. Yes, please.
How were these released? Were they released as they were?
Yes. So that's a whole other part of the story which I had to leave out. So the first run was 10,000 copies, and Congress got the great majority of these sets, and each representative in the House and each senator got a fixed number of sets that they could give their constituents for free, which explains why the OR has spread so far and wide. All contributors were eligible for sets, and then people wrote in asking whether they're leftovers, and there were leftovers. So the business records of the office within the War Department that was working on this collection is actually really fascinating, because every single day you see the mail coming in of people from every conceivable corner of the country, north, south, east, west, asking for records. And then when the first print runs out, they go into a second printing to answer demand. So it's, in some ways, it's a very democratic enterprise, in the sense that people contribute to it, and then the people profit from it, in the sense that it does spread. It's not only in the very rich libraries or the homes of senior veterans. So it's basically through Congress that it is first distributed. Yes.
About 15 years ago, a wonderful thing appeared, an ad for CD by Guild Press, the official record of the War of the Rebellion. And since that time, there have been a number of competing offerings. What's your opinion of the digitized version of the official record?
So when I first started using the OR, it was as an undergraduate, and I started with a CD. And the CD is even more seductive than the printed volumes, because you can search. And you can write an entire book just by searching, just by hitting keywords in the search box of the CD, and convince yourself that it's all there. So it's very useful. Again, I'm being so critical, but the first chapter of my next book is going to be based on the OR, right? I mean, it's not just the OR, but I will use it. Of course, we all will continue to use it. But I find the digitized versions, both of the CD and the fact that it's available for free online, both of these technologies mean that we will continue using the OR, to eternity. It's almost impossible to resist it. Those of us who've used it, right, for leisure or for work, know that you can just drown in it and never reemerge, and never think about how limited it is in all sorts of ways. But it's a good resource. Again, I've used it myself. I don't want to exaggerate the extent to which it's problematic, but I think that we just never think of it as being problematic. Nicole.
I was curious about precedents. Was there a compilation or anything published for the Mexican-American War? Are they looking to the Franco-Prussian War, and are there records published? Obviously, that's a very different kind of conflict. And I'm wondering, too, you talked about the way in which it becomes paradigmatic. Is there, do you see its, pushing, of course,
Great. So compiling original records is an American tradition that goes back to the Revolution. In fact, Bostonians started compiling records of the struggle against England before 1776. So it's absolutely common, and Congress pays for several large and expensive compilations over the course of the 19th century until it opens its own government printing office, which it establishes as a way to better control the process of compiling, printing, and distributing primary documents on all sorts of issues. Foreign affairs, the papers of leading revolutionaries, even kind of more mundane agricultural records that are of interest to the public. So there's definitely a tradition, and the OR doesn't come out of nowhere, but there is no other source that has attained this position as the source of knowledge about a certain event. And, you know, it's the source, and it is arguably the event, which makes for its unparalleled predominance in historical writing in general. As for a paradigm, there are 20th century collections, both of World War I, though not in the United States, in Britain. The foreign policy papers go into the 20th century. So the tradition kind of carries forward. You know, I think that the fact that the losers and the winners of the war are presented, their stories are presented together side by side with nothing contextualizing what went on behind the scenes of the military struggle, makes for the uniqueness and the influence of the source. I think it answered a real need at that moment in the late 19th century, but I think it also produced and generated a literature both of military history, but also a kind of a national narrative of the war, which was a lot easier to write once you had this compilation that gave you both sides of the story. And I think that explains, and honestly, late 19th century writers of these great national narratives of the Civil War pay very generous tribute to the official records in their acknowledgments and notes, saying, you know, I could not have written this history without the official records. And so I think it's both the axis, the kind of very nitty-gritty reality of just having these documents before you in these printed and bound volumes, which we still all love using, but also the way that the OR sort of sets up the story that I think is conducive to a certain way of thinking about writing a national history rather than a sectional one. Yes, please.
I'm not a historian, so I was just curious, you know, when you're going to write about a particular subject, or, you know, let's just say for some reason you're going to write about the 10th Virginia Heavy Artillery, you would maybe use the OR to give you a skeletal structure. And what are some other sources that you found useful to sort of fill in the nitty-gritty, if you will?
Right.
You've got like the skeleton, but
Right. But it's not, you know, it's not an exclusive source for any of us, I think. Absolutely. So we all work in brick and mortar archive. I like to think of the OR as a moving archive because it's, you know, so easy to get to. But every serious historian goes to brick and mortar archives where there are entire collections of documents that have not been compiled and arranged, but are just sort of have been collected, but they haven't been published. These are, you know, tricky boundaries. Even on, I'm kind of thinking about the vocabulary I'm using. We all use archives that house collections by individuals, sometimes truly lowly soldiers, women. We do the best we can in unearthing the history of African Americans in the Civil War through testimonies of former slaves, through interviews African Americans gave in the press, autobiographies, biographies. So we work with both published and unpublished sources, which can be located. Let's say, the Virginia Historical Society here in Richmond is an incredible archive of private papers, dominated, I think in hindsight, having spent quite a lot of time there researching my first book, dominated by indeed more elite sources as well, families that kept records and thought enough of themselves to actually, send them to storage. If you don't think that your life meant anything or would be interesting to anyone, then you wouldn't bother. But if you did think that it meant something and would be interesting, then you would collect it and make sure that posterity would be aware of it. And then there are state archives. So for example, the state archives of North Carolina offer very different records. A lot of poorer folks, more fragmentary exchanges, but through so these are letters that that North Carolinians wrote the North Carolina state establishment during the Civil War. So these are some of the people who are barred from the OR. These are the people making applications, right? These are the people who are writing about very small things that for compilers of the OR were not interesting, but for us as social cultural historians are very interesting. So it's a combination of archives of private archives, of state rather than federal archives, and the distinction here is crucial. Though both are government, but the state government will get very different mail from the federal government, and of a repository of sources about African Americans, which are often not in the archive, but have been assembled by historians and compilers over the past 150 years. Yes, please.
Hi, I'll reveal myself as an archivist before my question.
Oh, wow.
So, two-pronged. One, I'm very curious about where you sourced all this background information about the construction of the OR, and second, to expand it generally, how helpful is it to have archivists and other compilers and clerks putting into record of how the process works? And your understanding of the construction of it and where it lies in a neutral record.
Okay, great. So the reconstructing the process of making the OR has been my own process, which has, I don't know, gone on now for 6 years of going back and forth between Tel Aviv and Washington, D.C., and going through every piece of paper in the archive of the archive. And some of these boxes have been left unopened since the early 20th century, since it's, considered very technical stuff, and only when you open them and does the kind of rich cultural content of the correspondence between people compiling records jump at you. So it's all there. There are other published studies of the OR, but they're either very old or very limited. And so the piece-by-piece reconstruction of the process is something that I've really had to do through the records that the record keepers have left us, which ties into your second question. It's incredibly useful, and I urge you as an archivist to leave detailed notes of your process, because the OR was compiled, and we have this paper trail that I now can put together and see how the process worked. But brick and mortar archives are also, of course, anything but neutral spaces. There is an archivist, and that person decides what they're going to buy or what they're going to accept as a donation and how to organize that. And all of these decisions are incredibly meaningful. So I'll give just one example from my own process of working on this collection. When I first started looking at it in the summer of 2011, I was looking for all sorts of things, basically largely unanswerable questions that I was interested in. And the fact that the Archive of the Archive was organized alphabetically meant that I saw the process at work, because I saw correspondence from the 1860s, and then I saw correspondence from the 1880s, let's say all grouped under the letter P. And so I noticed how the ground shifts so remarkably over the course of 20 years, and I realized that there was a process, that something happened here, that they start out in 1865 by calling the Confederacy the so-called Confederacy, and end up in 1885, in this extremely friendly relationship with Jefferson Davis or Jubal Early, who are basically working, it's not even working, they're volunteering as freelancers for the federal government. And so if the archivist who had organized these papers back in the day had organized them chronologically, I wouldn't have noticed it. I would have just looked at the 1860s, got out of it something, who knows what, and moved on with my life. The fact that they went for an alphabetical scheme meant that it was just all there waiting. So these things matter a great deal, as do issues of inclusion and exclusion. And honestly, in U.S. history, we haven't paid as much attention to these questions, but in other fields, let's say historians of Russia, they don't write anything without first taking up the question of what it is exactly that they're being allowed to look at, right? Who stored these papers, who organized them, who's pulling the strings behind the scenes and letting a historian see or not see a certain collection. It's obvious to them that there are forces at work, and that they need to take them into account as they are researching, because that will have a huge influence on the story that they'll eventually tell. I think in United States history, we are sometimes, I think, kind of lulled into submission, because the archives are so accessible and friendly, and you're a customer, and they're there to help you out, right? And so we don't often think about the fact, not in a sinister way, but just in a kind of theoretical sense of, okay, why is this collection here? Who put it here? And why? And when? And what was the story? And how does that influence my story? So our archivists are incredibly important people in shaping the histories that we read and write. They're just sort of behind, if the historian is behind the scenes, then the archivist is the scene behind the scene, and so largely invisible. Thank you.